A rude passenger mocked a humble traveler on a plane, only to freeze in shock when the captain revealed it was Dwayne Johnson. The Miami International Airport buzzed with activity, its sleek, modern interior echoing with the rhythmic sound of suitcase wheels and muffled announcements. Passengers moved with purpose, some clutching boarding passes, while others juggled coffee cups and carry-ons. Among them was a sharply dressed man, his tailored gray suit and polished leather shoes exuding the confidence of someone who knew his place in the world. He glanced around the first-class boarding gate with a look of subtle superiority, his eyes scanning the crowd as if searching for someone worth acknowledging. Nearby, a tall man in a hoodie and baseball cap waited quietly. He wore sneakers that had seen better days and carried a simple backpack slung over one shoulder. Unlike the suited businessman, he seemed content blending into the background, his head slightly lowered as he tapped away on his phone. A young boy seated nearby nudged his mother, whispering something with wide, excited eyes. His mother smiled softly, placing a finger on her lips to shush him. The businessman noticed the boy's excitement, but dismissed it as childish nonsense. His focus shifted back to his own world as he pulled out his phone to check emails, furrowing his brow as though the mere act of traveling had disrupted his busy, important life. The first-class boarding call came, and the passengers began lining up. The businessman strode forward with a practiced ease, his leather briefcase swinging in rhythm with his steps. The man in the hoodie followed behind him, calm and unhurried. The businessman shot a quick glance over his shoulder, his lips curling in faint disapproval as if the casually dressed man had wandered into the wrong line. As they boarded, the businessman took his seat by the aisle and immediately began adjusting his environment to suit his preferences. The man in the hoodie settled quietly a few rows ahead, gazing out the window with an air of calm that contrasted sharply with the bustling energy around him. The stage was set, though no one yet realized this flight would soon become anything but ordinary. The cabin filled with the usual pre-flight hum of activity, passengers stowing their luggage, the occasional chime of call buttons, and the muffled conversations of people settling in. The businessman, seated comfortably in his first-class aisle seat, adjusted his tie and flipped through emails on his tablet, the faint glow reflecting off his neatly styled hair. Across the aisle, a flight attendant approached the casually dressed man, her demeanor noticeably warmer than usual. "Mr. Johnson, is there anything I can get you before takeoff?" she asked politely, her smile sincere. The man, still focused on his phone, looked up briefly. "I'm good, thanks," he replied in a deep, calm voice, his tone friendly but unassuming. The businessman's ears perked up. He glanced at the casually dressed man, his gaze lingering for a moment longer than necessary. Something about the exchange irritated him. Why was the flight attendant addressing this man so personally? He didn't look like someone who belonged in first class, certainly not with that hoodie and worn-out sneakers. Leaning slightly into the aisle, the businessman gave a small, smug smirk. "Looks like first class isn't as exclusive as it used to be," he muttered, loud enough for those nearby to hear. A few passengers turned their heads, their expressions a mix of discomfort and curiosity. The casually dressed man, however, remained calm. He glanced briefly at the businessman, his face unreadable, and then returned his gaze to his phone, as if the comment hadn't even registered. The businessman wasn't done. Emboldened by the lack of reaction, he leaned back in his seat and added, "Did they start handing out free upgrades today?" This time his voice carried a sharper edge, dripping with condescension. The casual man shifted slightly in his seat, placing his phone face down on the tray table. His calm demeanor remained intact, though there was a flicker of something in his eyes, a quiet strength that went unnoticed by the businessman. The flight attendant returned, offering the businessman a drink. "Would you like anything, sir?" she asked, her professional tone unwavering. He waved her off dismissively. "No, I'm fine," he said, then shot another glance at the casually dressed man. "Some people just don't know how to dress for first class," he said, as if sharing an inside joke with her. The attendant's polite smile faltered for a brief second before she quickly regained her composure. "Let me know if you need anything," she said curtly, moving down the aisle. The man in the hoodie didn't flinch, nor did he offer any response. He simply adjusted his seatbelt and leaned back, looking out the window. The businessman watched him with growing irritation, mistaking the silence for weakness. As the plane prepared for takeoff, the businessman shook his head and muttered under his breath, "Unbelievable." He couldn't fathom how someone so ordinary could occupy the same space as him, someone who had worked tirelessly to earn his success, or so he thought. Unbeknownst to him, his words and actions were setting the stage for a lesson he would never forget. The plane reached cruising altitude, and the cabin settled into a subdued rhythm. The businessman sipped his drink, stealing occasional glances at the man in the hoodie, who remained quietly absorbed in his thoughts. Around them, passengers read newspapers, scrolled through phones, or chatted softly. But the businessman's focus stayed on his seatmate a few rows ahead. The calmness of the casually dressed man irked him. It wasn't just the man's attire. It was the way he seemed entirely unfazed, as if he didn't need validation from anyone. The businessman crossed his legs, leaned slightly into the aisle, and let out a chuckle loud enough to catch nearby attention. "What brings someone like you to first class?" he asked, his tone carrying a mocking edge. "Win a raffle? Or did they start letting in just anyone these days?" The man turned his head slightly, locking eyes with the businessman for a brief moment. His expression was calm, unreadable, as though he was trying to decide whether it was worth engaging. After a pause, he simply looked away, folding his arms and leaning back in his seat. The businessman's smirk widened. He saw the silence as a victory, as if he'd succeeded in unsettling the man. "Not much for conversation, huh?" he pressed, loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. A few heads turned, their expressions showing varying degrees of discomfort. Seated across the aisle, a young boy nudged his mother, whispering excitedly. His eyes darted toward the man in the hoodie. "Mom, isn't that—" "Shh," she replied gently, placing a finger to her lips. The businessman noticed the exchange and rolled his eyes. "Great," he muttered under his breath. "Now he's got a fan club." The flight attendant returned, offering snacks to the passengers. When she reached the man in the hoodie, her demeanor shifted noticeably. Her voice softened, and her smile became more personal. "Mr. Johnson, would you like anything else?" "I'm good, thank you," he replied, his tone polite but casual. The businessman's irritation grew. "Mr. Johnson," he repeated mockingly after the attendant walked away. "You'd think he was someone important." He laughed, leaning slightly toward a fellow passenger, a middle-aged man in a pressed suit. "The world's full of surprises these days, isn't it?" The other passenger gave an uncomfortable laugh, clearly wanting no part of the conversation. The young boy across the aisle whispered to his mother again, this time more audibly. "I think it's him. I saw him in that movie with the jungle." The businessman glanced at the boy, his smirk growing wider. "Let me guess," he said loudly, addressing the boy. "You think he's some big shot? Maybe a movie star?" He laughed, shaking his head. "Kid, don't believe everything you see on TV." The man in the hoodie shifted in his seat, adjusting the cuff of his jacket. He didn't speak, but his silence carried a weight that the businessman failed to notice. The boy's mother whispered something to him, trying to calm him down, but the boy was undeterred. "I know it's him," he insisted. The businessman leaned back in his seat, thoroughly amused. "Kids and their imaginations," he muttered. "Next thing you know, they'll think he's the president." A few passengers exchanged glances, their unease growing as the tension in the cabin thickened. The businessman seemed oblivious to the atmosphere, too absorbed in his need to assert dominance. As the plane flew on, the businessman couldn't help but steal another glance at the man in the hoodie. Something about his calmness gnawed at him. Why wasn't he reacting? Most people would have snapped back or at least looked annoyed by now. The man's composure wasn't just unusual. It was unsettling. The businessman decided to try one last jab. "Must be nice to ride first class without a care in the world," he said loudly, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Some of us have to work hard to get here." The man in the hoodie finally turned his head, his calm gaze meeting the businessman's. There was no anger, no defensiveness, just an unshakable confidence that seemed to say, "You don't bother me." Before the businessman could say anything else, the pilot's voice crackled over the intercom, announcing light turbulence ahead. The cabin crew moved swiftly, instructing passengers to fasten their seatbelts. The businessman scoffed, leaning back in his seat. "Turbulence," he muttered. "Just what we needed." What he didn't realize was that this flight was about to take an unexpected turn, one that would leave him questioning everything he thought he knew. The cabin lights dimmed slightly as the plane cruised steadily at 35,000 feet. Most passengers had settled into the rhythm of the flight, reading, napping, or scrolling through their devices. The businessman, however, remained restless. He shifted in his seat, occasionally glancing at the man in the hoodie, who now had his eyes closed and appeared entirely at peace. This only irritated the businessman further. How could someone so unremarkable remain so composed in the face of blatant provocation? The pilot's voice crackled over the intercom, breaking the relative calm. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're expecting some light turbulence ahead. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened. It should pass shortly." The businessman rolled his eyes and muttered, "Light turbulence. They always make it sound worse than it is." Within moments, the plane began to jolt slightly, the overhead bins rattling softly. Some passengers gripped their armrests, and a few exchanged nervous glances. The businessman, however, remained outwardly composed, though his knuckles whitened as he tightened his grip on the seat. The turbulence quickly escalated, the plane rocking more forcefully. Drinks spilled. A few gasps filled the cabin, and the seatbelt signs glowed brighter, as if to emphasize the seriousness of the situation. The businessman's composure started to crack. He pressed himself back into his seat, beads of sweat forming on his brow. The man in the hoodie opened his eyes calmly, glancing out the window as if assessing the situation. Noticing the businessman's growing discomfort, he leaned slightly back in his seat but said nothing. His calmness stood in stark contrast to the businessman's visible unease. A particularly rough jolt sent the businessman's tablet tumbling off his tray table. He fumbled to grab it, muttering curses under his breath. What kind of pilot lets this happen? Can't they just fly around it? His voice, tinged with panic, betrayed the confident facade he'd worked so hard to maintain. The turbulence persisted, and a loud thud from the overhead bins startled several passengers. A woman across the aisle clutched her husband's hand tightly, while a young man glanced nervously at the flight attendants, who remained calm but alert. The businessman turned toward the man in the hoodie, his panic now fully apparent. "This isn't normal, right? I mean, planes don't shake like this unless something's wrong, do they?" The man finally spoke, his voice steady and reassuring. "It's fine. Turbulence feels worse than it actually is. Just relax and breathe. It'll pass soon." The businessman stared at him, incredulous. "Relax? Easy for you to say. You're not the one sitting here wondering if this is the end." The man's expression didn't waver. "Trust me, it's not the end. The pilots are trained for this. Planes are built to handle turbulence like this. You're safe." Something in his tone, calm and confident, seemed to settle the businessman, even if just for a moment. He took a shaky breath, clutching the armrests tightly as the plane jolted again. "Why are you so calm?" the businessman asked, his voice quieter now, tinged with a mix of curiosity and irritation. "Are you some kind of expert or something?" The man didn't answer right away. Instead, he leaned back in his seat, letting the question linger in the air. "Let's just say I've been through tougher situations than a little turbulence," he said finally, his tone casual but firm. The businessman frowned, unsure how to respond. For the first time, he found himself genuinely curious about the man he had been mocking just moments ago. The turbulence began to ease, the jolts growing less severe until they stopped altogether. The pilot's voice returned, assuring passengers that the rough patch had passed and the flight would remain smooth for the remainder of the journey. A collective sigh of relief rippled through the cabin. The businessman loosened his grip on the armrests, his hands trembling slightly. He glanced at the man in the hoodie who had already returned to looking out the window, his calm demeanor unchanged. For a moment, the businessman considered saying thank you, but the words caught in his throat. Instead, he turned away, staring blankly at the darkened screen of his tablet. The turbulence may have ended, but a different kind of unease lingered within him, one he couldn't quite shake. There was something about the man's calmness, his presence, that unsettled him in a way he couldn't explain. Little did he know this flight was far from over, and the most surprising revelation was still to come. The cabin had settled back into an uneasy calm after the turbulence. Passengers adjusted their belongings, and a few exchanged nervous laughs, relieved that the worst seemed to be over. The businessman, however, remained tense. He glanced at the man in the hoodie, who sat unbothered, his gaze fixed on the horizon outside the window. There was something about this man that didn't sit right with him, his calmness, his silence, and the quiet confidence he carried. Across the aisle, the young boy, who had been fidgeting in his seat, could no longer contain his excitement. Tugging at his mother's sleeve, he whispered loudly enough for a few nearby passengers to hear. "Mom, I'm sure it's him. I know it is." His mother hushed him gently, glancing nervously at the businessman who was now watching them with raised eyebrows. The boy's enthusiasm seemed misplaced, almost comical to the businessman. "What now?" he muttered under his breath, shaking his head in irritation. The boy, noticing the businessman's glance, turned his attention toward him. His face lit up with the pure excitement only a child could muster. "Do you know who that is?" he asked, pointing subtly toward the man in the hoodie. His voice was filled with awe, as though he'd just uncovered a great secret. The businessman leaned back, folding his arms across his chest. "Let me guess," he replied, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "You think he's someone famous? A superhero, maybe?" The boy's eyes widened. "Not a superhero, but close. That's Dwayne Johnson. You know, The Rock." His voice rose slightly, drawing curious glances from a few other passengers. The businessman chuckled, shaking his head. "Kid, you've got quite the imagination. Trust me, that's not The Rock. The Rock wouldn't be sitting here in a hoodie acting like a regular guy." The boy frowned, clearly frustrated that his revelation wasn't being taken seriously. "But it is him. I saw him in the Jungle movie, and his voice, it's exactly the same." A few nearby passengers began whispering among themselves, their curiosity piqued. The businessman, however, dismissed it as childish nonsense. "Look, kid," he said, leaning forward slightly. "Just because someone looks a little like a movie star doesn't mean they are one. Trust me, I'd know if I was sitting near someone famous." The boy crossed his arms, pouting. "You'll see. He's just trying to keep a low profile. He probably doesn't want people bothering him." The businessman snorted, turning his attention back to his tablet. "Right. Because someone as famous as The Rock would definitely be flying commercial," he said sarcastically, earning a few uneasy chuckles from nearby passengers. The boy's mother leaned down, whispering softly to him. "Let it go, sweetheart. It doesn't matter if it's him or not." But the boy wasn't ready to give up. "You'll see," he muttered under his breath, staring determinedly at the man in the hoodie. The man in question, meanwhile, remained completely unbothered by the commotion around him. He didn't turn, didn't react, and didn't even glance in the boy's direction. It was as if he was in a world of his own, perfectly content with the quiet solitude of the flight. The businessman, however, couldn't shake the nagging feeling that the boy's words had stirred. While he dismissed the idea outright, there was a small part of him, buried beneath the layers of arrogance, that wondered. Could it really be? No, it was impossible. He scoffed at the thought, brushing it away as he leaned back in his seat. Little did he know the boy wasn't just guessing. He was about to be proven right in a way that would leave the entire cabin in stunned silence. The cabin had grown quiet again, save for the low hum of the engines. Most passengers seemed to have settled back into their routines. but an unspoken tension lingered. The businessman kept stealing glances at the man in the hoodie, his irritation mixed with a hint of curiosity. The young boy across the aisle continued to fidget, clearly bursting with excitement, while his mother gave him a knowing look to calm him down. As the plane began its descent, the pilot's voice crackled over the intercom, breaking the stillness. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're beginning our final approach to Los Angeles. I'd like to take a moment to thank a very special guest traveling with us today. It's not every day you have the honor of having Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson on board." The announcement hit the cabin like a lightning bolt. Heads turned, conversations stopped mid-sentence, and a wave of murmurs swept through the rows. Passengers craned their necks, looking around to see if the name they just heard was real, or some strange coincidence. The businessman froze in his seat. His face, which had been a picture of smug confidence for most of the flight, turned pale. His eyes darted toward the man in the hoodie, who now sat completely still, staring out the window as if nothing had happened. Slowly, the realization dawned on him, and his heart sank. Across the aisle, the boy let out a triumphant, "I told you!" His mother gently shushed him, but even she couldn't hide the slight smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. Other passengers began whispering excitedly, their eyes darting between each other and the calm figure in the hoodie. The businessman couldn't believe it. The man he had spent the entire flight mocking, dismissing, and belittling was none other than Dwayne Johnson, a global superstar, beloved by millions, and one of the most recognizable faces on the planet. How had he missed it? How had he been so blind? The flight attendant, who had managed to remain professional despite the earlier tension, approached the man with a warm smile. "Mr. Johnson, we'll be landing shortly. If there's anything else you need, please let me know." Dwayne nodded politely. "Thank you," he replied, his voice calm and kind, the same voice that had reassured the businessman during the turbulence. The businessman stared at him, his mind racing. All the pieces fell into place. The flight attendant's respectful tone, the boy's excitement, the man's quiet confidence. It had been right in front of him the whole time, and he had completely missed it. Worse, he had made a fool of himself in the process. Dwayne finally turned, his eyes meeting the businessman's. There was no anger or arrogance in his expression, only a quiet understanding. It was the kind of look that didn't need words to convey its meaning. The businessman's throat tightened, and he felt a lump of shame settle in his chest. The murmurs in the cabin grew louder as passengers started to whisper among themselves. Some pulled out their phones discreetly, hoping to snap a picture or share the moment with their friends. But Dwayne remained unfazed, his focus steady and calm, as though he had done this 1,000 times before. The businessman wanted to speak, to apologize, to say something, anything, but the words refused to come. His earlier arrogance had evaporated, leaving behind only regret. The man he had tried to belittle had shown him more kindness and patience than he deserved, and now the entire cabin knew the truth. As the plane descended further, the businessman sank deeper into his seat, wishing he could disappear. But one thing was certain: this flight, and this moment, was something he would never forget. As the plane touched down and the familiar jolt of the landing gear signaled their arrival, the businessman sat frozen, his mind racing with a mixture of shame and regret. He couldn't bring himself to look at Dwayne, whose calm demeanor only made his own behavior feel even more absurd. The whispers and stolen glances from other passengers continued, amplifying the businessman's discomfort. The man he had dismissed and insulted was not just someone significant. He was someone extraordinary. As the plane slowed and taxied toward the gate, Dwayne stood to retrieve his modest carry-on bag from the overhead compartment. He moved deliberately, unhurried, exuding a quiet authority that required no effort. The businessman's throat tightened as he watched. He knew he had to say something, but finding the courage felt impossible. Finally, as Dwayne prepared to step into the aisle, the businessman cleared his throat awkwardly. "Mr. Johnson," he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. Dwayne paused and turned, his expression neutral but attentive. Yeah? The businessman looked up, his face flushed with embarrassment. I just wanted to say, I'm sorry. I didn't realize who you were. His words stumbled over themselves, coming out rushed and clumsy. Dwayne studied him for a moment, his gaze steady. Then with a faint smile, he replied, And if I wasn't who you think I am, would it still be okay to talk to someone the way you did? The question hit like a punch to the gut. The businessman opened his mouth to respond, but no words came. He knew the answer, and the weight of it made him sink lower in his seat. Dwayne's tone softened, but his words carried unmistakable weight. Respect isn't about knowing someone's name or what they've done. It's about how you choose to treat people no matter who they are. The businessman nodded slowly, his eyes cast downward. You're right, he admitted quietly. I was out of line. Dwayne gave a small nod, acknowledging the apology without lingering on it. It's not about being right, he said. It's about being better. We all get it wrong sometimes, but what matters is what we learn from it. The businessman swallowed hard, feeling the full weight of those words. He had spent his life priding himself on his achievements, his image, his status, things that suddenly felt hollow in the face of Dwayne's quiet wisdom. As the flight attendants began preparing the cabin for disembarkation, Dwayne adjusted his bag and offered a parting thought. Next time, maybe take a moment to think about the person in front of you. You might be surprised what you find. With that, he turned and stepped into the aisle, greeting a few passengers with a polite nod as he made his way toward the exit. The businessman sat motionless, replaying the exchange in his mind. He wasn't just embarrassed, he was humbled. For the first time in years, he felt a genuine desire to change, to become the kind of person who gave respect freely, without judgment or expectation. It was a moment he wouldn't forget, a lesson that would stay with him far longer than the flight itself. As the plane docked at the gate and the seatbelt sign turned off, passengers began to gather their belongings. The businessman sat in his seat, unmoving, his thoughts a storm of regret and reflection. Around him, people whispered excitedly, many sneaking glances at Dwayne as he stood calmly in the aisle, waiting for his turn to exit. His presence, quiet yet commanding, filled the cabin without effort. The young boy across the aisle waved eagerly at Dwayne, his eyes glowing with excitement. "Bye, Mr. Johnson," he said with a grin. Dwayne turned, his face softening into a kind smile as he gave the boy a fist bump. "Take care, buddy," he replied warmly. The boy beamed, as if the brief exchange had made his entire day. Nearby passengers smiled at the interaction, their earlier unease replaced by admiration. The businessman, however, felt something entirely different. Watching Dwayne handle everything, the boy's excitement, the attention from the cabin, even his own rudeness, with such grace made him feel even smaller. He had spent the entire flight projecting superiority, yet here was a man whose kindness and humility had left an indelible mark on everyone around him. Dwayne picked up his bag and began walking toward the exit. As he passed the businessman, he paused briefly and looked down at him. There was no trace of anger or judgment in his expression, only a quiet understanding. "Take care of yourself," Dwayne said simply, his tone steady and genuine. Then he turned and continued down the aisle, disappearing into the jet bridge. The businessman sat frozen for a moment, those 4 words echoing in his mind. Take care of yourself. It wasn't a scolding or a dismissal. It was an invitation to do better, to reflect on the kind of person he wanted to be. As he finally stood to collect his belongings, he noticed the lingering glances from other passengers. Their expressions weren't mocking or judgmental, but they were a reminder of the lesson he had learned the hard way. Walking through the terminal, the businessman felt a strange mix of emotions: shame, humility, and, most unexpectedly, hope. He replayed Dwayne's words in his head, not just the lesson about respect, but the subtle encouragement to grow. This wasn't just a flight, It was a turning point. He didn't know what lay ahead, but he knew one thing for sure. He would never look at someone the same way again. Thank you for watching this incredible story of humility and kindness. If it resonated with you, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to our channel for more powerful stories that inspire and uplift. Check out the videos appearing on your screen now. They're filled with even more life-changing lessons you won't want to miss. See you in the next one.